delighted to have you join us at the beginning of our Payments Summit 2019. Obviously, in about 90 minutes or so, we'll get the official opening and introductory remarks from our President and CEO, Jerry Gates. But obviously, we're very pleased to have you join us here for a discussion around ISO 20022 and high-value payments systems. Obviously, we've been on this modernization journey for quite some time. I think the title of the session is quite appropriate in terms of paving the path. We've used the analogy with Payments Canada that we provide the payment systems highway. We provide critical infrastructure to support and enable the exchange of money and data within Canada. And so, obviously, as we continue to progress, we're getting closer and closer into the adoption and movement towards ISO 20022. So we're very pleased, and we've seen some obviously major changes and announcements in the last number of months, and we're very pleased to have a panel of real thought leaders in the industry on high-value payments and ISO 20022. What I'd like to do for those. My name is Mike Hoganson. I am the Director of Links Modernization, and I'm just going to ask the panel to do some brief introductions of themselves before I'll go into some of the logistics on the session, and then we'll move on from there.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Isabelle Bouille. I'm coming from SWIFT in La Heup, Belgium, and I'm part of the SWIFT Standards Market Practice team, and I will be kind of introducing you. Well, perhaps more than just introducing you. I'm not sure you know about the ISO migration, but introducing you on what are the services that SWIFT will put in place to help you with this important migration.
Hi, my name is James Southgate. I'm from the Bank of England. I'm responsible for policy relating to our HVPS and RTGS operations. So ISO 20022 and the implementation falls within my remit.
Good morning, everyone. I am Frank van Driessche. I'm with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Wholesale Products Department, where I look after the FedWire Fund service, the evolution of the service, and the introduction of ISO 2022. Before that, I spent 18 years with SWIFT. I joined the Fed late 2018, and I have to get used to that. As I'm now with the Fed, I need to add a little disclaimer that the thoughts and the views I express are my own, and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, nor of the US Federal Reserve System.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So what we're going to do today for the session is each of the speakers will have a few minutes to make some introductory remarks, give you a flavor as to the work that they've been doing, how things have been progressing around the ISO space. And obviously, we want to take questions as well from the audience. And we're going to try and make this interactive. We do have a polling question or a couple polling questions that we're going to ask you to respond to as we progress through the session. So if you have not downloaded the Summit app, you will need to download the app to respond to the poll questions. And if you go into the agenda for today's session and scroll down towards the bottom where it says live poll, there's two questions. They are actually open right now. So you could actually start responding to them, but don't. Okay. So we're going to put it up on the screen later, but we want to get some responses from you, and that will really hopefully help to drive some of the discussion, and obviously leaving some time towards the end to make sure that we're able to respond to any questions that we have from the audience. We may have a couple of microphones, or I think we may be okay with the room depending on people projecting their voice. So make sure you get the app open and be ready when we're going to be doing the polling questions. So just to start off, as I mentioned, obviously we've been on this journey for quite some time at Payments Canada, clearly articulated through the vision for the payments ecosystem, and obviously through the work that we've been doing, specifically around links. But ISO 20022 is fundamental for us in terms of a modernized payment system. We will enable ISO 20022 in all of our modernized systems. first and foremost, and obviously working closely with the industry in order to enable that. And it's really key for everything that we're doing. Specifically from a links perspective, obviously to tie it in around high-value payment systems, we are looking at obviously supporting ISO through the implementation of our new high-value system, links. Our focus in terms of the immediate future is the shift in the implementation of the first release of links. There's some significant changes that come into play with the implementation of links, the movement to a new risk model, upgrade and uplifts on the technology platform. And obviously that is quite a fundamental change from LVTS that has been up and running for just over 20 years. And while we will enable ISO messaging and we will support ISO messaging as part of the core capability in links for wire payments, we will be looking to define the overall adoption strategy, and it will come in at some point beyond the initial release of links. So we're looking at going live no earlier than Q3 2021 with release 1, again, focused on adoption of the new risk model, technology, improved resiliency, and we'll be working very closely with the industry, with members, with stakeholders to define the adoption strategy through the course of 2019 to ensure that obviously we're taking into consideration all of the key factors, a number of external factors, of course, in terms of what SWIFT is defining for their roadmap, looking at other jurisdictions, particularly south of the border for Fedwire and for chips, and obviously what others are doing overseas in terms of the ECB and Bank of England. So all of those factors really need to come into play as we look to define the best approach for Canada to move forward with the adoption of ISO 20022. And I think, we would expect that it would probably be, a minimum of 12 to 18 months after the release, after the implementation of the first release for links in 2021. Timelines, obviously, we have not defined that, but I think suffice to say that it is a major uplift to move forward and implement this first release of links. And so we will need time to work through some of the details in the planning and obviously working directly with the industry to implement the ISO messages as part of that future release. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Isabelle to share some of the more information on SWIFT and how they are progressing on ISO.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for having me here today and to be able to discuss with you the second passion I have in my life after my family. ISO 20022 has really become something very precious to me. Why? Because actually I was very much involved in the development of these messages that are going to be implemented very soon by many of you. And this started the work in 2004. So for 15 years, I've been deeply involved in developing, maintaining, helping implementation for ISO 20022. So it's a real privilege for me to be here today. So as said, the development started in 2004, and today what are we seeing is that all the major market infrastructures, and I'm going to move my little, voila, all the major market infrastructures representing the major currencies are currently working on their implementation work. What we have noticed is that from a timeline perspective, it looks very much that we're going to be more or less aligned, meaning that from 2021, we can expect to see all these major market infrastructures moving onto ISO 20022. Some are being located in the US, so the Fed and the TCH, others in Europe, such as the Eurosystem, Target 2, and EBA Euro 1. And then, of course, other major market infrastructures, as well as Hong Kong Clearing or Bank of England. But I will let Frank and James discuss about their own implementation, of course. So all of these market infrastructures actually are implementing what we call harmonized implementation guidelines, which have been built by the High Value Payment System Plus working group. It means that by doing so, all these implementations are harmonized in a certain way so that actually you ensure an end-to-end interoperability between these different market infrastructure. So as said, I mean, the only difference that you would notice in some cases is the fact that the approach for the migration might be slightly different from one market infrastructure to the other. Some will move in what we call the like-for-like approach, that meaning that they would want to be aligned fully with what you have today in Fin, which will allow actually easy translation from one format to the other. An example would be the Fed. Others, like the Euro system, they decided to move to what we call a fully fledged ISO 20022, meaning that they're going to move straight away to what we call an enriched ISO 20022. The good news is that from 2023, we can kind of expect that all the market infrastructures will be moving onto a fully fledged ISO 20022. This will ensure, of course, the interoperability between the different regions. So, I mean, because all of these market infrastructures announced their plans, all the big banks, the GTB banks, they're starting discussing the need actually to also migrate Fin to ISO 20022 in the many-to-many space. So this is why last year, December 2018, the board discussed and approved the migration in the many-to-many space. What does that mean? It means that every bank connected to SWIFT and using category 1, 2, and 9 should prepare for migration onto ISO 20022. Also, it's going to be on a fully fledged ISO 20022. It's going to be an enriched version of the message, meaning that you will not go into a like-for-like mode that would make the translation much easier. What is important to know is that the work that is being conducted by SWIFT today, as with the sponsorship of the PMPG, is to build implementation guidelines for this many-to-many space. This is a group that is called the Cross-Border Payment and Reporting Plus group, and this group is actually building the common guidelines for implementation. Important to know is that, I mean, for the users of SWIFT, these guidelines, they will be validated on the SWIFT network. So it means that every bank connected to SWIFT will have to follow strictly the rules set by the CBPR+. Also important to know for those working on GPI, the guidelines that we are currently building are fully aligned with the GPI requirements. So for those that are involved in the work with GPI, elements such as the UETR will be included in the ISO message for the many-to-many space. Now, the migration that was announced by the board will start November 2021. There's going to be a coexistence period because we won't be able to impose a big bang to all of our banks. We will have a coexistence of 4 years. So you can expect the migration to take place from November 2021 to November 2025. So we're talking category 1, 2, and 9. So we were not talking about category 5, 3, or 7, or any other category. What does it mean for you as Canadian banks? It means that from November 2021, and this is a message that we want to pass on, you need to be able to at least receive ISO 20022 messages on SwiftNet. That's a very important message that we want to pass. It's not like you can wait till 2025. No, from November 2021, you must be able to receive ISO 20022. So you might think, oh, what are we going to do? We won't be ready on time. Well, SWIFT is actually working on services that we will be able to provide to the banks in order to help you with this migration. One of the examples would be that we will put in place what we call the SwiftNet service, because you're going to need to change your protocol from Fin to SwiftNet. We will help you, for those working on Fin today, with the relationship management application. We will help you migrate those RMAs into ISO 20022. This is something we will help you with. We will also help you with the addressing. Today, we know that to address messages, you need to use the BIC actually in the header of the messages. Well, this will move into what we call a distinguished name, meaning that you're going to have to migrate your addressing as well. So this is something that we will typically help you out with. One of the biggest services that we will do and that we will offer our banks is translation. So the CBPR Plus group is currently working on building translation rules. So the translation service can be used differently depending on the type of bank you are. Imagine you're a big GTB bank, you're really sophisticated, and you might say, we don't want to use a central service, translation service by SWIFT. We want to be able to do this in our back office. You will, for that, be able to actually implement the translation rules that are going to be made freely available on my standards. As I said, it's extremely important that everyone follows the same translation rules. The reason being that if you are not compliant with CBPR Plus translation rules, your messages will be nagged. So that's for the big banks. But then we know that most of our BICs, actually connected BICs, they're smaller banks with about 100 transactions per day. We want, of course, to manage disruption for you as a smaller bank. So we will put in place a central translation service, meaning that whenever you will be the receiver of an ISO 20022 message, actually the SWIFT will capture this ISO 20022, we will send it to the translation service, and you will receive through SwiftNet an envelope that contains both the ISO 20022 message, but also a translated FIN message. The FIN-MT message will most probably be truncated because we know that actually the ISO messages are bigger than the MT messages, and it will be flagged as being translated and truncated. So that's a service that we will be offering. Now, if you are a FIN sender and you send a message, an instruction to a FIN receiver, that you can keep on doing till 2025. But from November 2025, you will no longer be able to exchange any FIN messages on the SWIFT network. There's another option. It could very well be that as a sender, you on FIN, and you want to reach someone that is ISO 20022. In this case, of course, FIN will not be able to transport an envelope as we would do for ISO 20022. So as a bank, as a receiver of this FIN message, because you're ISO capable, you will be able through APIs to request the translation using the central translation service. So it's going to be very flexible. You can opt in, opt out of each of these services anytime, and the service will be made available from first half of 2020. So our message to you today, to close this presentation, is to tell you that it's going to happen. 2021 is very close by. No way you can escape. So perhaps it would be a good idea to really start discussing this internally, preparing for this. Also, a message that we want to pass on is that if you are an intermediary bank, it's extremely important that you migrate quickly. Why? Because as an intermediary, you will receive that envelope with FIN and MT, but you will not be able to pass on that ISO 20022 message. It means that you run the risk of having to transport a truncated FIN message. And in some cases, in some jurisdictions, this is quite a problem. Also, another message I would like to pass on to you, please stay tuned on Swift.com. We are going to start launching information campaigns. So on a quarterly basis, you can expect to get lots of information posted there to keep you posted on how the migration is going and how Swift can help you. So I would like to thank you for your time, and then I will pass on the mic to James. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Isabelle. So now from the international just to a specific place across the pond, I thought it'd be useful to give you an update of how we are approaching this challenge from the UK's perspective. This, which you probably can't see actually, because it's probably too far away and too small, but never mind. We are sending the slides out, I think. So essentially, this gives our timetable. And how we are taking ISO 20022 is to think about where we ultimately want to end up. And where we ultimately want to end up is when we introduce our new RTGS system, the current one dates from 1996, and some of the system operators are younger than it now, which is slightly depressing. 2023, the new system comes in, and we want ISO 20022 with rich functionality, with enhanced data. And we are making a very clear stance that we want structured data from that point. So structured addresses, we want LEIs in transactions between financial institutions, we want purpose codes in certain other financial transactions as well, and housing transactions. That's all related actually to some of the enhanced functionality we want to offer in RTGS as a whole. So for instance, we need the purpose codes in there because as part of our improved operational resilience, we want to essentially be able to prioritise transactions should we have some kind of impaired functionality. So we need that information in there. And then really it's been a case of working backwards from there. Very clear message we had from our stakeholders in the industry was that they don't want to move to from MT to ISO and from basic message to rich message all in one go. We have to move from MT to MX, the ISO network, all in one go because we're on Y copy in the UK. So we recognise that we should split those two things out. So that is why the year before, in 2022, we will move to ISO on a like-for-like basis. However, we are also looking to offer, for those that can do it, an ability to exchange enhanced messages. So the idea is that we will have a separate closed user group, and some of the challenger banks have really been saying to us, look, we can do this, our system's already on ISO 20022. We're actually having to remove the translator rather than put a translator in. We've got that capability. If we can do that capability between us, why can't we do it when we go live with ISO? So that's something we're exploring for 2022, but at minimum, everyone moves on like for like. And then the other clear message we got as part of our consultation is you need to give us time in order to do this. This is a big job. We need a minimum of 24 months. And working backwards from that, what that means is that we need to issue all the guidance and the messages by the end of 2020 for the enhanced ISO 20022 message, the key message being the common credit message that we'll be using across both retail and wholesale systems. And we need to get the market guidance for the like-for-like out by the end of 2019, so only 7 months away now. We've been having some great workshops with our direct participants in CHAPS. It has highlighted that just the move for like-for-like is in fact quite involved, and there is a lot of work to move from MT standards to ISO. Some of the stuff is even just the language. So originators versus creditors and debitors, for instance. It's just getting into that new mindset. And it's important that we get everyone really up to speed with this over the next 6 or 7 months. So that's kind of where we are. One of the very key things I should note as well is that we want the market guidance to be on, as well as there being technical guidance, we've had a clear message that different sectors want market guidance. So the housing sector wants to ensure that no matter which system they use in order to send the payment message, so if regardless of whether they send, say, a housing transaction over faster payments or CHAPS in the future, they want to obviously use the CCM, but they want to make sure that it is being used consistently. So the end solicitor knows exactly which fields to fill out for the housing transaction and in what style, and so the receiver knows exactly what to receive and in what style. And that really is key to getting some of the real gains from an enhanced and structured message. You need consistent use, and you need everyone to understand how to do that. So that is where we are at the moment in the UK. As I say, it really is, although we're heading for 2023, it really is all go.
even just for the like-for-like is a lot of work, and then the enhanced, a lot of work next year in order to get all the technical and market guidance together. Great. I'll now pass on to Frank. There you go.
Good morning, everyone. I will now be providing you an update from the south of what the Federal Reserve Bank and the Clearinghouse, but I won't speak on behalf of them, is doing very much in sync. Now, the challenge of the Fed is a little bit like the challenge of SWIFT, is that we have 8,000 direct participants. So the Fed has decided not to go with a big bang, and we will go with a phased migration. And that has impacted our migration plan, as you will see immediately on this slide. We have decided to move in 3 phases, where the first one, as you see on the slide, is called the ISO preparation. Now, important to point out is that this is actually not ISO yet. What we're doing in phase 1, which is coming next year, November 2020, is a cleanup of the proprietary format that we're using today. The Fed is not a SWIFT-based system, so we're using our own proprietary format. We will do a cleanup of that format in preparation of phase 2, where we will start migration. Now, the cleanup initially was related to the SWIFT release 2020, when SWIFT intended to remove all the unstructured party identifications. So we had to bring our proprietary format in line to guarantee interoperability. Now, when SWIFT, the community, the banks actually decided to put that release on hold, we decided to still go ahead with it because we needed it to enable our phase 2. We had to clean up and get all the unclear usage and misusage of fields and tags in our messages out of the way to be able to accommodate a coexistence phase in phase 2. Now, phase 2 will be kicked off in March 2020, first quarter of 2022. That is where we will move to an ISO like-for-like migration. Now, like-for-like have been questioned a lot of what the purpose and the business reasons would be to do anything like a like-for-like migration. Why would you rip out something that works perfectly well and replace it by ISO to do exactly the same thing? Well, that is because we have to map from one format to another for an 18-month period. So the like-for-like is purely because the Fed will put itself in the middle, will take in proprietary formats and map them to ISO 2022, or will take in banks that already migrated ISO 2022 messages and map it back to the proprietary format. This will last for 18 months. Where the Fed will actually map all these messages. It's still difficult after 5 months in the job to get my employer right. So 18 months, like-for-like migration, but with a clear end date where all banks will be cut over from proprietary formats that will be completely decommissioned onto ISO 2022. We then foresee a stability period for 1 up to 3 months. We just want to make sure that all banks, the 8,000 of them, have no issues, especially that last wave, because the first wave banks, if they have an issue and we're moving in with both environments up, they can actually fall back. For the last wave of migration, we had to include this stability period to make sure that the last banks moving, actually, if they would encounter issues, that we could bring them back to the old proprietary format. We foresee this period to last up to 3 months. And then, finally, in November Q4 2023, we will cut over to ISO Enhanced. So this is where all the new features, all the richness of ISO will be switched on. This is where, as James mentioned, we will move to the structured party identifications. We will move to rich remittance information. And that will be a big bang migration there, where all banks coming from phase 2, everyone is moved on like-for-like. In November 2023, everyone will move to enriched. Now, all the enriched features are optional, which means the banks that do not have the business case to move or start using richer remittance data or more party identifications can actually stay with the implementation on ISO that they've done for phase 2. Now, I'll add a lessons learned from a Fed point of view with this timeline, is that what we've seen is the crucial importance of communication, education. It is amazing that we're now going with phase 1 in November 2020, and we still have participants that do not have a clue. So we need to hammer on, this is going to happen, this is going in, everything has been coded, and we're testing. So the need for communication is one of the crucial lessons. Education. Also, you need to get the vendors involved. Many of our users were around the table when we were discussing the implementation of ISO, but the vendors It's their business, know up to the detail, and the devil is in the detail of this implementation of ISO. So second most important lesson was these vendors, you want them around the table, because in our case, they probably migrate around 5,000 of our banks use a vendor. Okay, I will pause here and then move to questions.
So, if I could ask that you get your phones out, we're going to move to the first polling question, just to get a sense of how people are feeling, how you're thinking about ISO 20022. How comfortable are you with the dates that are being defined for the migration? So this is just in its totality. Obviously, we've heard from different market infrastructures between obviously the US and Bank of England and SWIFT obviously has a global role. So we have a few responses in terms of very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, or no, not so comfortable. Still feeling quite uncomfortable. So if you go into the session and scroll down to the live poll, I'll just give you a couple seconds and we will see where we've landed. Okay. Okay. Well, a lot kind of sitting in the middle, so somewhat uncomfortable, probably comfortable. And that wasn't an option. No disturb. Okay. Well, obviously, what we're trying to do as part of this panel is to see how can we raise the comfort level. What is the information that you think that you need if you're from an institution that participates directly, if you're an organization, obviously, who would be leveraging the services and really looking forward to take advantage of the rollout of ISO 20022, specifically around wire payments and high value. So we'd like to try to explore that a little bit more, and hopefully at the end of the session you'll come away with an increased level of comfort in terms of how we will be progressing over the coming months and years on this key initiative. I think, Isabelle, maybe if I start with you, SWIFT had come out with the consultation document last year, talked about a multi-phased, and obviously based on feedback and discussions with senior management, with the board and with the jurisdictions, the move to the coexistence phase in this first foray starting in 2021. I'm just wondering if you're able to share some information around how that somewhat evolved and moving into that in terms of the value that you think that brings to, I guess, to the industry, and how SWIFT obviously is looking to drive and move that forward.
Yeah. Actually, yes, indeed. We had that consultation paper. This is where it came out that indeed the big banks, they wanted to avoid having to maintain two different syntaxes. So this is where it really came. And then clearly, it quickly came clear that the industry wanted to receive as much information as possible on how they should prepare for this. And very quickly, they came with this request for translation. So I think that the translation service that we're putting in place today is one of the main deliverables that will help all of our customers migrating onto ISO 20022. And of course, we're very open to any additional suggestion that should come from the industry. And of course, as I mentioned, I think that what we really want to focus on also is the communication. I think that, and I see Driessche is in the room today, she's asking, and she's been doing that for so many months now, please SWIFT provide us with roadmaps. This is something that we're definitely going to work on so that it's clear for everybody what is to be expected, because as we mentioned, November 2021 is not a day that will be avoidable. So if there's anything, I mean, we're always very open to any kind of suggestions that could be brought, to make your life easier. And yeah, That's
James, from your perspective in the UK, you last year undertook quite a comprehensive consultation. You made reference to how it helped to shape and define the plan as you've laid it out. Were there some key learnings that came out of that discussion and the consultation from the industry? That may be something that you'd be able to share with us in terms of something that maybe from a Canadian perspective we should be thinking about as well.
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing to say is that we had over 70 responses to our consultation from across different parts of industry. Financial institutions, you've got to bear in mind that unlike Frank's 8,000, we have 33 direct participants in our systems, but also technology providers, other financial market infrastructures themselves as well, even some from kind of trade associations and end users. I think there were a few really key findings. First of all, there was very positive support for the direction, and people recognised that really this is the opportunity to make change. These standards sit in the back of your systems for generations before anyone ever makes a change. If you've got the hood open, really now is the time to introduce all this innovation. And people are really keen to see much better, much richer data, which will help them all sorts of things. Fraud, economic crime prevention, enhanced operational resilience, better analytics, better business information, potential to offer new and innovative services. One of the very key messages, though, and this is probably, again, a particular challenge with having such a tiered structure in the UK, is you do need to get, as Frank said, that education out there. We don't have just direct users, we have correspondence of indirect users of indirect users of direct users. And actually that information needs to go all the way down the chain and all the way around the world. And you need to be clear to end users how they are going to get their information on what they do with this data and how they submit this data. So is this going to be provided centrally, or is it going to be done by their direct participants and their own correspondent banks as well? The other thing that was clear is the idea of a common credit message used across wholesale and retail schemes, and potentially for the cash leg of securities payments in the future. That's still something under discussion. Everyone loved the idea of having it harmonised. One of the big questions that's come out was, so how are you actually going to do that and ensure that not only at the point of implementation it's harmonised, but in 10 years' time, once we've gone through a whole load of changes. And so we have set up a governance forum, the Standards Advisory Panel, which is across industry, looks at wholesale, retail, the lot, and seeks to ensure that we do remain harmonised going forwards. That is also something we will have to face in the international space going forwards as well. So obviously we've got the HVPS guidelines, but they themselves will need to evolve in the future as we seek to innovate. So I think those were some of the really key things, as well as look, we need information as soon as possible.
Mm. And Frank, you touched on how you've engaged the industry and communicate, obviously, is first and foremost knowledge transfer awareness, but particularly interested in the engagement on the vendor community and how they may be able to support the participants, because obviously this is, stating the obvious, an extremely complex move into ISO, even at a like-for-like, and then into an enhanced phase. What did you see as some of the kind of what do you see as some of the risks in terms of the plan as it's been defined, and how you're looking to try to mitigate that through various options?
So some of the key challenges, I mentioned that we have 8,000 banks. Now that might sound like a nightmare, and up to a certain extent it is, but it depends a little bit on the type of participant. I mean, we have still hundreds of banks that call in a payment. We still have those. Now for them, the impact of this migration will be almost none. because they will keep on calling in their payments, and they might need to get used to maybe some terminology, but that's something where we quite easily can actually shield them. We then have thousands of online users, and there too, I mean, the Fed provides the screens. Yes, they will have to deal with new screens, they will have to deal with new ways, new pieces of data. But I would say that for those thousands of banks, I mean, nothing really that a good education program and communication program can address. And then we have the remainder of the banks, and you referred to the hood, and actually I thought a little bit, it will depend a little bit on when they open the lid of their systems, what they find in there. If they, over the years, have been putting Band-Aid on Band-Aid and patch after patch, and they look at this beautiful bowl of spaghetti in there, this is going to be a challenge. And that is also why one of the other lessons, and you said, James, about the timing, it is crucial to announce a date and stick to it, because it has to be real, because that will get the executive support and will get the budgets. Because for some of the banks, this is huge, because they've been limping on by many of the implementations that had to be done. And I mean, many of the FATF requirements, the 2-2 cover payments, where they've been patching their systems. The ISO implementation is not something necessarily they can get away with a patch. So depending, the other challenge is then when they open the lid and they might not like what they see, what are their timelines? Because there's many pieces moving in the industry, there's many projects, and ISO is kind of like instrumental to the modernization, but the modernization itself, it's not about putting in a new standard, it's what that standard is going to do for the industry. But you're living it too, you have ISO, you have the modernization, the new link system, the new high-value payment system, you have the real-time rails that are moving too. So there's so many projects, so in how far are their internal timelines aligned with the Fed timelines, for example, in our case? They have to do this by 2020, the first step. Less than 2 years after, they have to start migration. And if they're late, yes, they have the 18-month period, but these dates are now set in stone. We will stick to them. So that should help them with get these projects up and running. Then, one of the risks is that all this happens out of sync. So there it has already been mentioned. The Fed was at the beginning of the discussions of HVPS Plus. Together with the clearinghouse, we were there. We are fully aligned with HVPS Plus. So any of our bigger global players, anyone exposed to other markets, for example, the Canadian market, at least they have this common denominator. So they can look holistically at this implementation and cater for high-value payments across all the markets they're in. So that's one of the things why the interoperability and the reusability, reaping the benefit of the initial investment in ISO, that if they do this in the US, but their branch is playing within England, and they have a branch also in Canada, that they can reap the benefits of the big initial investment by replicating, because at the end, high-value payment in the Fed will be done more or less exactly the same way across Bank of England, who's also abiding the HVPS Plus guidelines, and in Canada. So I think that's one of the big benefits, and kudos to Swift there, that we were there around the table at the beginning, and we made sure that our business can be done when we respect 100% HVPS Plus guidelines. So those are a couple of things that we are faced with.
If I may perhaps echo on James and Frank, actually at Swift we have this initiative of the ISO MI Summit, where actually we have all this market infrastructure meeting on a yearly basis and discussing some strategical topics. And lately we had a discussion in New York where actually I think the agreement that we reached is that to say that all the market infrastructure would actually implement the same version of the ISO 20022 message, being the standards release 2019, and that the objective would be to remain on that release of the messages till at least 2023. So as Frank mentioned, HVPS Plus has played a major role in building these implementation guidelines. And what we plan to do is to actually migrate those implementation guidelines on a yearly basis together with the HVPS Plus members. So we agree on the changes that we want to apply, because as James correctly mentioned, these guidelines, they will actually evolve with the time for regulatory reasons, for example. So the groups that have put in place HVPS Plus and CBPR Plus for the many-to-many space. Their living groups, they will meet on a yearly basis. And as we do for FIN today with the Payments Maintenance Working Group, we will review and maintain these implementation guidelines. And what we will do with the MI Summit is make sure that all market infrastructure remain on the same version of the implementation guidelines and ISO standards to ensure this interoperability. The objective is longer term, is to try and reach a certain yearly maintenance as we have today in FIN, which is a process that works perfectly well today. However, from day one, we will implement a common version, and then we will gain a certain stability to make sure that everyone feels comfortable to then start discussing how we're going to move forward with the maintenance.
And I think probably I'd just like to add from a Canadian perspective, Payments Canada, we are at the table in terms of
Yes.
the MI ISO discussions, working with the other jurisdictions and SWIFT to understand how we land and agree on some of these principles and bringing that back then to the industry as we go through. We were one of the early adopters in signing on to the harmonization charter. So the initial messages that we are defining as part of the Links modernization program are aligned, and they are based off of the HVPS Plus, and that's really obviously in order to maintain interoperability with the other jurisdictions and try to, obviously as much as possible, avoid any sort of a made in Canada type solution, because we obviously recognize the cross-border implications around interoperability for wires. So that's very much key for us. I would like to open the floor to see if there are any questions that people may have. We've got a few more that we can go through. Ken, okay, and then do we have a microphone or do we just? No. Do you need?
No.
Okay.
Just a quick question for Isabelle. You mentioned the UETR and ISO 2022. I remember a few years ago there was a bit of a problem there that the ISO field for UETR was too short. Has that been resolved?
Yes, so with the standards release 2019, that's the reason why everyone moving with this version of the message, there has been a new dedicated field which can be validated as well, and which is 36 characters, while the other identification fields are 35. Yeah, so, I mean, this has been foreseen, indeed.
So I agree with ISO how important it is and enhance, and I also see all these. So I know you can't hear her.
Hold us.
Here's the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. So I completely agree with the importance of ISO. I am seeing all this industry coming together, which is extremely good. I heard everybody's schedule. For example, James, you described how Bank of England is going, with the schedule and stuff like that. Do you guys have little concern of how the FI can catch up with all these things? Because, we're not just clearing with Canada, we clear with, different RTGS system as well. So it is really good to sit down and think about, let's say, Bank of England, your schedule. Okay, we'll think about how we can meet it. With all these things going on, do you guys have concern that, because Isabelle, you talk about we've started the discussion 15 years ago, but in the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to do so many things at the same time. So how do you guys think that it can help the financial institute on that?
I can have an idea on there. I mean, I think first thing to do, and maybe some banks have this, but you would have to draw your map as an organization where you participate globally and have all the timelines and all the projects. And if we just restrict this now to ISO 2022, all systems that have committed to ISO their timelines, get that picture, global picture of where your organization is participating, whether it's in the US or Asia, or you cover the whole world, and then see all those timelines and map them out, and then see when it's going to start hitting you. Now, this probably should have been done already a couple of years ago, but then fair enough, I mentioned the importance of publishing a date, and many markets have waited really late until finally committing to that date. So it's kind of like a chicken and an egg discussion. But I think that will give you an idea, and then depending on where you see the moving parts and how big your market presence is there, or the importance of that market, I think then you can come up with an approach that you can justify. If you see that your main markets are moving within 3 years, which is not very likely that this is going to start happening, then you want to kind of like put all the attention on there. If you're in a certain market and the time is a little bit out and it doesn't fit with your organizational timeline of all projects, maybe you can get away with kind of a patch and depend on translation services. So it will need a little bit, it will depend a little bit on the picture you get back when you map out, these are my markets, these are the volumes, and these are their timelines. So I think you first need that picture on what is it and when is it going to hit me.
I would just, I'd agree with that. And I'd actually say as a RT operator, I know we are discussing this all very, very much. I am not clear whether, you know, X Bank, London, whom we're discussing ISO with, is necessarily fully tied up with their contacts in New York, Canada, you know, Europe, Asia, everywhere. And actually, I think that is a really important point. The big global firms themselves need to make sure that they are joined up. And it's an interesting question about whether there is more we can do, potentially including via SWIFT, which has done a lot on the kind of education and communication side here, in order to ensure that that message is landing on the kind of global CTO's table, that this is happening across all jurisdictions and all the systems, you know, and a lot, particularly with enhanced data, the effect is about needing to connect systems that previously weren't connected to get the data as much as actually handling the format. That this is a really big initiative, and there needs to be a lot of focus on this.
I would definitely, just to add to that, going back to some of the points that were raised earlier, again, very complex. There's a lot of risk involved in that. How we can help participants, member institutions in terms of Payment Canada, I think taking lessons from other jurisdictions, and as James pointed out, we are talking with them to, if I dare say, derive perhaps some overarching guiding principles around, obviously, you know, clear articulation of dates and commitment to those dates, publication of standards well enough in advance so that participants have visibility into those standards, so that you're able to, again, as you bring those back internally, you're able to pull things in terms of, well, we know what Target's doing in terms of ECB, we know what CHAPS is doing in Bank of England, the Fed, and then, as you say, build out that roadmap. So, you know, at least from a Canadian perspective, you know, while we're still working through that, I think that at least for us is a key lesson to then say, yes, clear dates, commitments, and articulate information in advance on the standards so that members can plan appropriately, and that we have the necessary time to support the development.
So a couple of things, and I think the situation in Canada is slightly different than, for example, the US or for SWIFT. What are the consequences if you don't make the dates? And from a SWIFT perspective, I know the consequences are you can't send the messages. I mean, you're shut out of the system, which, you know, in Canada, because we're so dependent on it from a LVTS/links point of view, kind of you're shut out of the banking system as a bank. But from a Fed perspective, because you are doing the centralized translation without me, I mean, the end users being blind to that process, what happens if, for example, a large bank in the States cannot make the dates? I know you have the wiggle room for the 1 to 3 months, but at some point in time, they've got to be there. Like, you can't continue doing that. And from a BOE perspective, like, just want to understand what's the carrot here, obviously, is the data, but kind of want to understand what the stick is as well.
So we have that stability period, and you might have seen on the slide that some of the dates are target dates, and that's what we're working against. We're coding, we're testing, but we do recognize that what if a big bank cannot make the date for whatever reason? I mean, they could have a cyber attack that takes them out for a couple of months, and that has full priority, for example. Sorry? So that stability period could be extended if need be. Now, that will not just be we're going to extend the period and going to get an additional 3 months. There's going to be the stick. There might be penalties, surcharges to the transaction fees and these kind of things. Right now, we think that we started communicating, did the consultation years ago. It has also taken us years to get where we are now. We're going out with a massive campaign now. We're doing workshops, webinars, and in the deck that will be shared, you find all that information. Everything is available online. They will have to come with very strong arguments to change these dates. So even if a bank misses the beginning of the wave, it's an 18-month period followed by up to 3 months. That's almost another 2 years from when you know that I'm in trouble. You have 18 plus months to fix it. And of course, there's also the reputational impact if you cannot make the date. And we're going fully in sync with the clearinghouse, which means our dates are fully aligned. The approach is fully aligned, the phased migration also for the clearinghouse. So if they miss the date from a Fed point of view and they are a clearinghouse participant, they're missing that date too. So it's not like they can say, well, I'm missing the Fed date, but I can then do everything through the clearinghouse or the other way around. We're going fully in sync to avoid further interoperability issues, because there will be interoperability issues. The poll, I'm comfortable. However, we move in November 2023. SWIFT starts enabling in 2021. There are going to be richer transactions that are sent to US banks, Fed participants. If they have to forward that transaction, they're in trouble because we have a like for like until November 2023. So there's still a lot of issues that need to be tackled. It's not going to be, yeah, we all move with an agreed upon common standard implementation guideline. We all move in similar timelines, but it's not a big bang, which means there are going to be issues somewhere around the line. The ECB moving in November 2021, we're moving in November 2023. That's a 2-year where, and we can't truncate, and the banks can't truncate. There's a travel rule. So that's going to cause some issues for the banks, but they will have to make those dates.
Yeah. And I'll just say one additional thing for the Bank of England we're doing is, given we've got everyone under one roof, HVPS, RTGS, and the Prudential Regulation Authority, we are talking to the supervisors of these banks to make sure they are aware of ISO 20022 and make sure they are aware of the consequences, so that they are asking the firms, where are your plans? How do you ensure that you're ready? Unfortunately not a carrot, just an extra stick, but nevertheless a very important one.
One last quick question. Sure, Britta. Got a few minutes left here.
Yeah, just a very short one. How do you structure planning? How much time do you allow for planning? What are your guiding principles? What is your planning for test strategy? Because that's a major part of being ready, being correct and validated, ready. Any short statement from all of you, please?
Do you want to start?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So on the SWIFT side, the specifications are currently being built for CBPR Plus and will be available for testing for a full year before November 2021. So from November 2020, you can expect to be able to test, and this is going to be in a form of penny testing.
Yeah, Bank of England, we intend to put testing tools out there well in advance so that people can kind of bounce messages at it and see what's valid. That's why we've had draft schema out since last year to get people ready, but we recognise that people will only really find things out with that active testing.
What do you mean schema's out?
The schema, so for the common credit message, yeah.
From the Fed point of view, I mean, all the timelines, all the planning has been agreed within a group of 40 banks with all vendors present. We have a very strict mechanism and no one can access the specifications. It's all through registered participants and vendors. That group is kind of our soundboard, and we have used them to come up with all the planning and time and testing schedules, which means we're allowing for more time than we usually do with the release. We have a double environment that will be set up. Vendors will have pre-access. So the timeline has been, I'm not going to say now approved by them, but we had our 40 banks and every single vendor in the room when all these discussions took place. And it has taken months to agree with them on an acceptable time frame. So
For how many months for testing?
for testing is a year for the banks and more for vendors. Vendors will have pre-access to the testing environment and then a double testing environment because we also need to onboard, as strange as this might sound, in the proprietary format. So we will have an ISO testing environment and a proprietary format environment. All the translation rules and mechanisms will also be available from that point of view, so banks can actually send in messages and get the translation versions back for them to test too.
So we're down to the short straws on our session, so we've only got less than a minute or so. We'd like to take the opportunity to ask you a second polling question, somewhat selfishly, obviously, in terms of Payments Canada. And as we're thinking about what we've heard today, obviously there's a number of key inputs and considerations for how we define our adoption strategy for ISO 20022 for links. So this is a bit of a pick list that you can pick any that you think apply. We've identified, obviously, harmonization and talking about interoperability and working closely with other jurisdictions. Timing around, obviously, the timeline SWIFT has defined and how much in advance should we be thinking about that. Information and training, we've heard, obviously, is key. That's really about engagement with the industry. Potentially a phased adoption that could include like for like, which we've heard from both Bank of England and the Fed, who defined that. Or potentially moving more into a direct adoption to ISO 20022. So we are interested to hear your views as to what you see as some of those top key considerations that can help to inform us for Payments Canada as we define our strategy in the coming months. If you've gone in and had an opportunity to respond. Okay. Well, information, training, awareness, that's communication's always the top for sure. Timing and harmonization. Okay. Very interesting. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on this early morning first day session of the Summit 2019. And please join me in thanking our panelists for a very great, exciting session.